Hare Om Namaha. The following excerpt is from a letter by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada to one of his temple presidents dated November 27th, 1971. Quote, "People must know that our Krishna philosophy will save the world from all kinds of dangerous conditions." Unquote. This is in the category of a prophecy, and as such, it must come to pass. Notice the emphasis here is on transcendental knowledge, Krishna philosophy. We all know that Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna movement will, in its pure form, eventually be chanted in every town and village of the world. Such is not the case at this time, but in due course, it will come to pass. Now, the following excerpt is from the purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada to Chapter 8, Text 17 of Bhagavad Gita. Quote, "These four yugas, rotating 1,000 times, comprise one day of Brahma, and the same number comprise one night. Brahma lives 100 such quote-unquote years and then dies. These quote-unquote 100 years, by Earth calculations, total to 311 trillion and 40 billion Earth years. By these calculations, the life of Brahma seems fantastic and interminable, but from the viewpoint of eternity, it is as brief as a lightning flash." Unquote. Higher intelligence entails transcendental perspective. The principles of time and scale should not be ignored when attempting to understand Krishna consciousness, or what appears to have come from it, on this lonely outpost called Earth in the Iron Age. On the scale of an average human life, as per what it can be considered in the Western world today, the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation appears to be a long-running institution. On the scale of the remaining duration of Lord Chaitanya's Golden Age, however, so-called ISKCON has taken up about 0.5% of that time, in other words, 0.005. Via the principle of scale, we need a much more expansive and indeed universal perspective when it comes to judging the duration and strength of so-called ISKCON. It can also be noted that so-called ISKCON changes very fast. It has already made 3 major transformations since the departure of His Grace, Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. It is virtually certain that it will make more. Its state of being has not remained steady, and this indicates that its propensity for or susceptibility to transformation is endemic to its very existence. You require this transcendental perspective. You require it in order to realize and to help realize the great plan. As you may remember, if you're a regular viewer, that was briefly mentioned last month. The great plan in this iron age of quarrel and hypocrisy is non-different from all of the goals inclusive to Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. in the measure of your conviction in the great plan, you will be able to take advantage of this month's KCD monthly video presentation. Now, always remember, misuse of a great science does not render it useless. It is also important to both know and realize that any kind of sahajya manifestation is not part of the great plan and can never be part of it. On the contrary, sahajya is a disturbance only to the great plan. In his very long article from mid-1943 entitled Theosophy Ends in Vaishnavism, which was posted in Back to Godhead at that time, Prabhupada described how to understand the great plan. Quote, "This great plan is explained in the Bhagavad Gita in two ultimate shlokas, in other words, the 65th and the 66th shlokas of the 18th chapter, which conclude the teachings of Bhagavad Gita. He should only serve the purpose of the Supreme Personality of Godhead according to his, capital H, his great plan, under the guidance of him, capitalized, or his, capitalized, bona fide representative. This will gradually lead to the position of eternal servitude of the eternal person," unquote. The emphasis from this excerpt is the necessity for the service to the great plan being conducted under the guidance of the bona fide spiritual master, because none of us in Kali Yuga have a direct tap to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Guidance includes the spiritual master's directives and instructions. Disobedience by Prabhupada's leading secretaries to his instructions is only a disturbance to the great plan. That disturbance is embedded throughout so-called ISKCON, which is a sahajya manifestation. Another way of saying the same thing is that in order to know, visualize, and realize the great plan of Lord Chaitanya's Hare Krishna movement, it is incumbent upon us to recognize the root issues of how and why so-called ISKCON has deviated from that great plan. Recognizing these root issues is both a transcendentally positive and materially negative process. Vidyang cha vidyang chayas tad vedopayang saha avidyayamrit yung tirtva vidyayamritam ashnute. Quote, "Only one who knows both the process of nescience and that of transcendental knowledge can transcend repeated birth and death and enjoy the nectar of immortality," unquote. Vidya means knowledge, transcendental knowledge. Avidya means ignorance or nescience, which is false science or mistaken knowledge, and which always opposes transcendental knowledge. Sahajyas have a very strong connection to avidya, although this is not recognized by those with paltry development in real knowledge. It is also not recognized by those with a limited perspective of higher intelligence or no higher intelligence, which ignores the principle of scale. You need to recognize Sahajya movements such as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. You need to recognize them for what they actually are in order to attain that vision. You cannot allow yourself to be enamored by temporary appearances of international superstructures that appear to be formidable evidence of something which ultimately they are not. In Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, shloka 16, we find the following. Nasato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate sataha, upayor api drishtoantas, tvanayos tattvadarshibhihi. The seers of the truth, by study of the nature of both, know that of the non-existent there is no endurance, and of the eternal there is no change, unquote. When an institution is deviated from the directives of its founder Acharya, it enters into the realm of asat, also called nasato in this particular shloka, which means that it has no eternal standing. It appears to have that due to its rituals, its governing body, its beautiful deities, and its claim, make that false claim, of being linked to the founder Acharya. But those appearances are deceiving. By upgrading your intelligence through higher perspective, you can see through the false claims of the deviated institution. Otherwise, you can't see through it. You'll be bewildered by it, those false claims. Now, we are aware that Prabhupada made 3 well-known prophecies. There's also a 4th one, and it will be discussed. Prophecies are infallible, and His divine grace, having all 23 mystic powers as a Bhagavan realized Uttama Adhikari, He wasn't very inclined to make mere forecasts. Still, He did give some of those indications, such as the following excerpt in a letter to Hangsadutta dated April 11th, 1972, quote, I cannot understand why, instead of one GBC man, a person outside the commission was given so much power and there was to be immediate action without divulging the matter to the devotees. And I am surprised that none of the GBC members detected the defects in the procedure. It was detected only when it came to me. What will happen when I am not here? Shall everything be spoiled by GBC? Unquote. This particular excerpt is not in the category of a prophecy, but the use of the verb shall is indicative that it was not unlikely to transpire, and indeed it did come to pass after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. Now, here is one of his distinct prophecies. Quote, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has forecast that this Hare Krishna mantra will be heard in every nook and cranny of the globe. He is God, so it will happen. That is a fact. So if we take advantage, notice the preposition if, so if we take advantage, then we may take the credit. But if we do not, someone else will, unquote. This, or an almost exact version of it, was mailed as a prophecy. Actually, it's Lord Chaitanya's prophecy, technically. It was mailed to more than one of Prabhupada's leading secretaries in the early 70s. Almost the same wording. The issue here, listen carefully, is equivalency. This is the issue. Although the excerpt establishes the fact that what was then Prabhupada's movement and what is so-called ISKCON now was never a stone-cold lock to fulfill the prophecy. Never. It was always provisional. When the conditions, if the conditions or provisions were not met, no such result can or would be expected. There were 2 other notable prophecies made by His divine grace. One was that Prabhupada's books in due course would become the law books of mankind for the remainder of the Golden Age. The other was that the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness would save the world from barbarity. We quoted something connected to that at the beginning of this video. Again, the issue here is equivalency, which will be explained. Prabhupada was hopeful that his organization would be the agent to fulfill these prophecies. As such, the way he wrote about the chief prophecy could be interpreted to mean that his branch of the Chaitanya tree, founded in the mid-60s in the United States, would be the providential agent for making the prophecy emerge in its full glory. Prophecies are not mere forecasts. Although it appears that he never officially recorded it, as it is not found in any of his morning walks, room conversations, platform lectures, or letters in the folio, it was common knowledge throughout the movement that His Divine Grace prophesied that his books would eventually be accepted as the law books of mankind at some point in the Golden Age. Certainly such is not the case now. But that eventual development is nevertheless in the category of a prophecy. Let us now return to the real issue: equivalency. The all-in, true believer fanatics of so-called ISKCON have a vested interest in interpreting all such prophecies as referring specifically and only to their organized religion. They believe, as true believers, that there is no possibility that the fulfillment of any such prophecy made by His Divine Grace could be applicable to anyone else or any other branch of Lord Chaitanya's tree of devotional service. Yet, Prabhupada did add the caveat, didn't he? Quote, "If we take advantage, then we may take the credit. But if we do not, someone else will." The preposition if is used twice there. If. At this time, no sane or serious transcendentalist believes that so-called ISKCON and its institution and its power node, the vitiated GBC, is qualified to fulfill any of the above-mentioned prophecies. Quite the contrary. The Upasampradaya is delaying their fulfillment. The Upasampradaya of so-called ISKCON. However, it can get much worse. As long as a cadre of those fanatics continues to believe that their Upasatharma can, and indeed will, fulfill the prophecies, we are potentially in store for all kinds of tribulation and atrocities in the indeterminate future. It is not at all unlikely that most of us will still be alive to have to experience that, unless we nip it in the bud now. In late 1972, Prabhupada wrote in a letter to one of his temple presidents that all other movements except the Krishna consciousness movement will fail. If you want to do so, you can call that a prophecy. The sentimental idea that opulent deity worship, that it alone establishes what is, or which is, the bona fide Krishna consciousness movement, was belied by Prabhupada during a morning walk on July 9th, 1974, quote, "So we have to become very strong preacher. Then this movement will stay. If you simply take the temple worship, it will not stay very long," unquote. Once again, the future status of his particular branch of the Hare Krishna movement was irreconcilably made provisional here in that statement on the morning walk. There were plenty of other statements and excerpts from letters that established it as such. Provisional. It was never given the status of a metaphysical certainty that it would remain bona fide, equivalent to the fulfillment of the prophecies. In fact, as we just heard, it was not even a certainty that would even last that long. There are two reasons for this. One, due to free will, or if you prefer, the potential that free will would be misused by his leading secretaries, which it was. Due to free will, it could never be given such irreversible assurance by any genuine guru. And two, Prabhupada was already being given strong indications, beginning in 1972, that his movement was going to deviate from him. In point of fact, it was already doing so to a significant extent before he departed physical manifestation. Consider this exchange with a leading secretary during a morning walk on July 13th, 1974 in Los Angeles. Quote, "Now the Revati Nandana and this man and Shyamasundar is making a click. I can understand. What they are planning, that I also know. But I don't wish to disclose it. So if these things come, then how this movement will go on? Politics, diplomacy, fraud, cheating, these are the general qualification of the Western countries. Do you admit or not?" Unquote. These kinds of qualifications are obviously major disqualifications for even attaining the mode of goodness, what to speak of reaching Shuddha Sattva. Your host speaker was noticing that these evils were degrading the movement in this way by the mid-70s. Yet, the question can be raised, what held it together? You could say that Prabhupada's physical presence and continuing influence due to that presence was holding it together. No one would disagree with that. Yet, there was more to it. And there continues to be more to it at this time. This is where equivalency comes in. When by the mid-80s so much corruption became obvious to almost everyone, what was holding it together after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation? Again, we return to the root issue, which is equivalency. This was and remains the big psychological weapon. Now, there's so many ways, so many angles I can explain equivalency, but I'm choosing one of these only. I'm choosing to shed light on it from the ISKCON fanatics' perspective, especially whenever one of those fellows deems necessary to exert verbally this kind of a mindset that I'm about to explain. Please keep in the forefront that none of this that I'm about to state is your host speaker's perspective whatsoever. It never has been, and it never will be. But I was aware of this mentality quite early on, so now I'm going to verbalize a kind of copy of it. The fanatical ISKCON perspective can be concisely summarized, and I'm going to do it in a first-person way. It can be summarized as follows, quote, "Prabhupada was non-different from Krishna, and Prabhupada's ISKCON movement was non-different from him. It still is non-different from him. If you are criticizing his movement, this is enviousness of him, and he is screaming at you for such criticism. Prabhupada's GBC is also non-different from him, which means that it is non-different from Krishna. You can be forgiven for some mild, constructive criticism of its decisions by consulting senior devotees in ISKCON and the proper channels, but you can never make any other kinds of criticisms of it. If you engage in destructive criticism of ISKCON or the GBC, that is your enviousness and hatred of Krishna, manifesting against his movement, ISKCON, which is destined to fulfill Lord Chaitanya's prediction that Krishna consciousness will soon spread to every town and village of the world, unquote, from the fanatic. Obviously, your host speaker could go into even more detail as to how the fanatic thinks and feels. I'm quite well aware of it. The mentality that they all share in various iterations has been summarized by me here. There's really no need to go into more detail. The above-mentioned summary of fanatical thinking by the true believers of so-called ISKCON suffices. Tatvamasi. Equivalency has just been presented precisely, concisely, and adequately. And it's a flawed conception. The fanatic has that flawed conception. It is a version of a projected destiny via a warped variety of so-called Krishna consciousness. The fanatics represent and push that projected destiny. But it is only actually dangerous at this stage in history if you are psychophysically still entangled in its wheelhouse. Why? Because if you are still connected to it, that institutional delusion creates cognitive dissonance once you begin to realize just how deep are the flaws embedded in it. You become conflicted. It creates bewilderment when you believe in its equivalency while simultaneously becoming partially awakened to its deviations that cannot possibly have any connection to a genuine Guru Parampara. Doubt is created in a weakened intelligence. Such cognitive dissonance will immediately spread to the mind, meaning the emotional level. After all, either bona fide or bogus, any manifestation of Krishna consciousness or so-called Krishna consciousness will have the emotional element of the mind as a major part of the package. It is called Bhakti Yoga for a reason. Emotionally buying into the somehow or other rationalization, you ignore the cult's major flaws, read deviations. Misguided in this way, you believe in its claim to equivalency, that it, so-called ISKCON, and only it, is still destined to save the world, to spread to every town and village, to be the only conduit in order for you to attain the spiritual world, the only way. You believe it will publish the books of the future that become the law books of mankind, and only it will do so. If you are afflicted with these hopes and dreams, you have a major problem. You are believing in a fairy tale. You are dealing with contradictions, but you feel guilt about doubting so-called ISKCON. And most likely you'll also feel some fear. And you will want to get free from all of that guilt and fear. And such cognitive dissonance will lead you to stop confronting even the surface issues, what to speak of the root issues. And you'll choose to go all in with so-called ISKCON. Shove all your chips into the center of the table. believing it to be the way, the truth, and the light, and that no one comes to Prabhupada or can even be linked to Prabhupada except through so-called ISKCON. This is what such a false belief, and please note, it is very false. This is what such a false belief the mentally challenged and cognitively dissonant devotees experience. It is a belief that so-called ISKCON and the vitiated GBC, parenthetically, quote, Prabhupada's GBC, as one of the first echelon men recently commented, the belief that the GBC is just like the Ganges, pure no matter what, floats on top. And that's also the idea of equivalency. However, that comparison is not at all apt. Instead, it is nothing more than wishful thinking. The fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation is an emotion-based pseudo-yoga system, one which strongly tended to inculcate fanaticism in its members even before it went off the rails. And please note, figuratively speaking, so-called ISKCON is a train that has at very high speed and with significant power gone off the rails since the last week of March 1978. Prabhupada's prophecies are one thing. They are metaphysical locks. However, all the apparent quote-unquote guarantees allegedly made by Prabhupada of any of those prophecies relative to the corporate institution are nothing more than hopes. They were nothing more, and they still are nothing more, if even that. It was all provisional. This right conclusion has been validated in many places. I'm not going to list all of them, but I'll list one. Here's an excerpt from a letter to one of his leading secretaries on the GBC dated December 10th, 1971. Quote, actually he, capitalized, actually he has said that this KC movement will spread to every nook and corner of the world, so there is no doubt it will happen. He is God, so how can he be wrong? So it will happen. So if we are intelligent, we will assist and get the credit. Otherwise, someone else will, unquote. During a morning walk on June 5th, 1976, Prabhupada stated that the Hare Krishna movement will go on for 10,000 years. That would mean 10,000 years from the end of the 15th century, the appearance of Lord Chaitanya. Yet, we are also in the heart of Kali Yuga, which promotes postmodern hedonism of the Western adventure. This brings us back to the Sahaja cult, so-called ISKCON. As aforementioned, in terms of the average length of a human life in the West, their show has been running for a significant period of time in that comparison. However, that is not the best or most helpful perspective. When we view the Sahaja corruption that is so-called ISKCON, the right perspective is that it is only a quick blip on the radar screen. It is a little speed bump in the extreme juxtaposition of materialism and the absolute truth which exists at this time. 43 years is a very small duration, practically nothing from any higher perspective. As such, this deviation can be stopped, and it must be stopped. Yet, although this higher perspective is required, it must also be supplemented. It must be supplemented with cause and effect. When the spiritual master, just days before the end of his physical manifestation, proclaims, quote, everything is frustrated, unquote. It does not get worse than that. It portends the ominous, and that does not happen in a vacuum. There are a series of causes and effects over the years foreshadowing the spiritual master's final disgust with his leading disciples just a month before he left them. Krishna is ultimately the cause of all causes. Cause and effect are factually one, because the cause is present in the effect. This is verified in the Bhagavatam. This principle works both positively and negatively. Negatively, it works as Mishra karma and Vikarma. Please note, each proceeding cause is present in the immediate effect, which then becomes the next cause to the next effect. And this certainly includes deviations, which also become causes, and they remain as effects for years and for decades. Such is the case as far as so-called ISKCON is concerned. The first major deviation was the ad hoc centralization scheme of 1972. Superficially, Prabhupada reversed it, but that does not mean automatically that the cause was eradicated. The next major deviation was failing to hold elections for the GBC in the summer of 1973. Its charter, the direction of management, demanded the vote, but it wasn't held. That negligent cause and effect was amplified. The next deviation was the plainclothes pick of the late 1973. Prabhupada never wanted it. He specifically expressed that in letters to his leading secretary in SoCal. But he and his cohorts went ahead and did it anyway. As such, the previous causes remained in the next effect, which was a running thread. The disobedience was intrinsic to his mail collectors in particular, as they were not displaying tilak, shaved head, flag, and tulsi neck beads, which Prabhupada demanded they have on them when they distribute and collect. But instead, money became the thing. The men wore wigs without tilak and were devious in their collection approaches, as were the women. The next major deviation was not holding the mandated, by its formative charter, the mandated vote, again, for the rotating GBC. It was supposed to be rotating. The second vote, was scheduled for the summer of 1976. Now, this will be rationalized. To say that Prabhupada let all of this slide is not to know the history between 1973 and 1976, but that requires too much detail to get into at this time in this presentation. All of the previous causes remained in the ongoing negative effect, which was becoming a very powerful thread, leading to the zonal Acharya imposition of 1978, a very major negative effect. Returning to the destinarian outlook, it's not held by all the members of so-called ISKCON. That's to be expected. It's the fanatics who hold it. Yet it must also be remembered that in all cults, it is the controlling wizards, the fanatics in the upper echelon, which drive it to its next destination, to its next transformation, to its next effect. That has certainly been the case in so-called ISKCON since Prabhupada's disappearance in the late 70s. The cult ambiance of the fanatics, read equivalency, created by destiny's arrangement, allegedly, is what is the most important thing for us to consider here, to understand through higher perspective. So-called ISKCON is not going to fulfill the prophecies, but it may fulfill effete, perverted reflections of them. It is much larger and more diffuse worldwide than the other two deviations, which are offshoots from it anyway. Concerning the fanatics, it would be a major shock, indeed hospitalizing some of the fanatics immediately, if any one of them were to realize the truth of what they are actually saying and doing. A sense of being the chosen ones pervades so-called ISKCON. And the top echelon takes full advantage of this. They believe in their own selves as being special, which is integral to their mega narcissism. Still, we must realize that the contract was broken. The devotional covenant was always provisional, and its terms were not met. The leaders of so-called ISKCON deviated from the founder Acharya, and by such apostasy, they could no longer legitimately claim to be agents for fulfilling any of the prophecies. In a letter to Ho Hen Pei, dated May 10th, 1973, we read the following quote: "If the intelligent men of the world like yourself cooperate with this all-important mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we can save the world from the state of misery and chaos that now prevails," unquote. We are all agents of subtler forces. We are all transmitters of forces, and they control and use us. The issue is what energy we choose to be controlled by. And if we choose to be agents of Lord Chaitanya's golden age, then chaos can and will be checked in due course. The law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, states that without interference from the living force, matter automatically moves towards chaos. We have plenty of experience that such is the case. Now, this is an important point. It's a little bit difficult to understand. Listen carefully. At the same time, the conditioned living force can alter matter into formations which prevent short-term chaos, but that are conducive to eventual chaos. The worst example of this fact, this truth, is the Sahajiya cults. This principle is not recognized by the population at large, which is functioning solely on either the exoteric plane or outside of it. Besides those people in general, even most of the devotees, just after Prabhupada left physical manifestation, were bewildered as to what went down and what was going down. For one thing, they almost all believed the propaganda pushed by those who most benefited from it, that Prabhupada appointed 11 new initiating spiritual masters. We all know now that he only appointed Ritviks, but this was not discovered until 1980 and 1981, and let me tell you, those who made it known at that time paid a steep price for doing so. After the founder left, there was some unavoidable demoralization that seeped into the movement. This made it ripe for a kind of regime change, especially since the tentacles of just such a transformation had already formed, doing damage while gaining traction even while Prabhupada was still present. Prabhupada, in 1977, in October, could see how it was playing out and how it would play out, and it deeply appalled him. He expressed that frustration. He could see that his leading secretaries would alter the movement, along with the way that most of his devotees would think about their relationships to the movement. It was a planned process, and Prabhupada became aware of their plan. Demoralization is prone to lead to concoctions. The zonal acharya imposition was both radical and new and a concoction. The movement's structure was changed by it. Many, if not all, of Prabhupada's devotees believed it to be a good thing, when in point of fact it was harmful. Those who saw it as changing Vaishnava tradition and its foundational structures of the parampara were ostracized and demonized, leading to an unavoidable crisis. That crisis was not present just after Prabhupada departed. It was created. The movement was still strong and unified just after he left. However, this concocted crisis of the zonal acharya imposition fed into the new gurus and their unauthorized designs in the name of keeping the society from collapsing into chaos. When the zonal scheme crashed and burned, the second transformation, which, please note, still had all the previous causes fully present in its effect, attempted via compromise, successfully attempted, to create a kind of normalization of the situation. This, however, was just another predetermined solution that was unauthorized. It was also a radical transformation, but this was only recognized by a handful of devotees, such as your host speaker, who fought it and rejected it and paid the price. The second transformation was not normal at all, because it still created a new cognitive dissonance in the members of Prabhupada's missions, who were not willing to abandon logic and ethics. As such, they could see the glaring contradiction and compromise intrinsic to the second transformation. How could quote-unquote gurus, who pretended to be Mahabhagavats, nothing more than Sahajas while they were engaged in that pretension, how could they remain spiritual masters? How could their disciples be genuinely initiated by them when all of those newcomers were improperly initiated in the first place? Professor Blue Blood and his like-minded presidents successfully implemented a new agenda, which was just as bogus as the first transformation, despite some obvious differences on the superficial planes. By that time, all of the temples were stocked with newcomers, improperly initiated fanatics and sentimentalists, dominant amongst them. Be one of us. Come into this house where the whole world can live. It was only superficially an improvement, but at its foundation it was still connected to avidya. For this second transformation to go down, all it took was for the majority of good devotees to do nothing to stop it. Let the record show that they did just that. However, there were a few who were not going to take it. No more compromise. At the very least, now we must try to expose the evil for just what it is. In the second week of October 1977, Prabhupada's condition in Vrindavan deteriorated dramatically. He requested to be taken out on parikram. Denied. He requested, ordered, that all his disciples be informed to come to see him, as he knew that his disappearance was imminent. Denied. Just previously, the GBC men had successfully begged him to hold on for them and remain physically manifest. Immediately afterward, after conceding to their begging, for the first time in months, Prabhupada ate a full plate of solid food. Then, one of his leading secretaries and GBC men in the United States, in a state of controlled panic, sent an urgent memo. It was called that, by the way. An urgent memo to all temple presidents and governing body commissioners. That GBC man quoted what Prabhupada had just said, which concluded in this way, quote, "Everything is frustrated," unquote. Everything had immediately gone south when the commissioners had departed India after his recovery. No one, not even his leading secretaries, was coming to see him after that, or in some cases, with TKG keeping them out, was being allowed to see him. At that point, His Divine Grace could see why they all begged him to stay, so that they could continue to use him as a figurehead while utilizing all of the funds collected by their disciples, technically his disciples, all those funds for their own projects and playgrounds. The die was cast. Although he said that he would complete the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada did not. Although he said that he would produce translations of Vedanta Sutra, Mahabharata, and Padma Purana, he did not. Although he said that he would live to be 100, such was not the case. After what was nothing short of a miraculous recovery, hope disappeared, and Prabhupada departed physical manifestation only a month later. Everything that went down after that can be traced back to the cause and effect which preceded it. Cause and effect, walk back the cat. It can all be reverse engineered to the handful of men who not only allowed it to happen, but indeed facilitated it. How much longer are you going to allow their tainted legacy to bamboozle you? When are you going to step up and try to stop them? Concerning allegiance to a broken compact that you have no business honoring anyway, how much longer are you going to allow fear and guilt and intimidation to plague you? When are you going to wake up and shout from the mountaintop that you are not going to take this anymore? The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. It can be stopped, and it must be stopped. In order to stop it, in order for you to contribute to stopping it, first exorcise it from your subtle being. This requires internal confrontation. Transcendental defiance is essential to this program. once you exorcise its influence and defy the institutional delusion known as so-called ISKCON, you will be able, if you are willing to do so, to help to expose it. Once it is exposed to a substantial degree, its momentum will be slowed and then stopped and then reversed. That is sorely wanted. Ultimately, its show bottle temples must be converted into nothing more than gold-plated deity worship museums, which in effect will terminate its influence in the Western world completely, but not in India, of course. That termination, it's certainly doable, but great effort is required. Lord Chaitanya's movement will save the world in its darkest hour, and Prabhupada verified this to one of his pet disciples in 1972. However, it is incumbent upon us to realize, having been given plenty of evidence to come to such a realization, that so-called ISKCON is not the agent of providence for Lord Chaitanya's movement. Instead, impelled by fate, capital F, it must be exposed, checked, and its influence terminated in order for the great prophecies of the great plan to be fulfilled completely and as soon as possible. Quote, it is announced by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Prithivite Ache Yata Nagaradi Grama. As many towns and villages are there on the surface of the globe, this movement will go on. Sarvatra Prachara Haibe Moranama. This will go on. It is already predicted by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Unquote. Let the record show that we tried. Sadeva Samya.